The transhumanists are a vanguard of the new world order, and they're going to create a universal brotherhood, right? A universal brotherhood. He says, among these transhumanists, we could cite Bill and Melinda Gates, Mother Teresa, and many, many, many New Age weirdos, right? So he lists all these different weirdos, and he says, by 2100, we'll have all of the world converted over to this thing, right? 2030, 2050, 2100. These are the key actuaried years, right? And by 2100, he says there'll be all mega cities. You'll all have to be, piled into these cities. Have you seen that movie Code 46 with Tim Robbins? You seen this? Right. This movie actually exemplifies what I'm talking about right here. Right. Children of Men, same idea. These films show that the giant mega cities where everybody's forced to live. You can't live on the land anymore. You can't be on the country. You can't be a country bumpkin anymore. Country boys cannot survive in this global order. You got to be moved into the mega cities. He says that will all be in place along with the giant global brain by 2100. That's what's coming. This is future history being written right here. Here's the plan. Left off last week with Alex in our grad class, we'll call it, on the writings of the elite. So there's going to be a multiple choice. You're going to have some homework. Pay attention. You're going to learn some stuff. Let's go to a clip that I was reminded of this week. Many of you have probably seen this clip, but I think this is really illustrative for showing the whole paradigm here, where we are now, what's going on, why the news is so baloney filled. Let's play that clip and you'll see what I mean.
Hi, I'm Fox San Antonio's Jessica Headley.
And I'm Ryan Wolf.
Our greatest responsibility is to serve our Treasure Valley communities,
the El Paso, Las Cruces communities,
Eastern Iowa communities,
Mid-Michigan communities.
We are extremely proud of the quality, balanced journalism that CBS 4 News produces.
But we are concerned about the trouble and irresponsible, one-sided news stories
plaguing our country.
The sharing of biased and false news has become all too common on social media. More alarming, some media outlets publish these same fake stories without checking facts first.
The sharing of biased and false
news has become all too common on social media.
More alarming, some media outlets publish these stories simply aren't true without checking facts first.
Unfortunately, some members of the media use their platforms to push their own personal bias and agenda to control exactly what people think. And this is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
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 What an amazing coincidence. Everybody just happened to say the same thing. I'm sure that was totally organic. Nothing weird or strange about that at all, right? Now, let's think about something here. If the Hamburglar and Ronald McDonald and Bill Cosby all got together and they sat down and they said, let's write out a plan of how we're going to rob the local convenience store of pudding pops, right? They sat down, they drew it up. Right, Bill Cosby drew it up, and then you found that plan, and you went to the convenience store guy and you said, Bill Cosby and the Hamburglar and the Cookie Monster, they're all coming to rob your pudding pops, right? The Bill Cosby's coming to rob the pudding pops, the feeble fable. You would think right away that you had discovered a plot and you would try them all and they would go to jail, right? If so, plots can be public for a century, however, and nobody goes to jail. Nobody gets in trouble. This is amazing. This is what blows my mind, that we can have books a century old. Right, let's go back to, let's do our first example here. Edward Bernays, Propaganda, 1928. In 1928, how does this book start out? He says, we are governed, our minds molded, our tastes formed, not by pudding pops, but by ideas that are suggested largely by men that we have never heard of. This is the logical result of the way in which our democratic society is organized. You see, and he goes on to talk about our invisible governors. Who makes up this invisible government? What? Where have we heard that term before? Well, in the last 4 years, we've heard it quite a bit, haven't we? This is 1928, right? Now, why does Bernays really matter? He's the father of modern propaganda. And he was in a circle of men, right? He actually renamed the War Department to the Defense Department. Okay, so this is not a conspiracy book. This is not a nobody. This is the father of modern propaganda. And where does propaganda come from? It comes out of military operations. And then it moves directly into advertising and media, right? The second chapter of the book, page 61, he says, this invisible government is made up of people, for example, who used to be in the OSS, the predecessor to the CIA. So they took all those techniques and tactics and tricks that they learned in the war theater and brought it over into the network news media. Yes, the heads of the three main networks, they were all from the OSS. Paley, Sarnoff, right? Walter Lippmann, right? The ad agency. So we start to realize that we have for a long time been under a coordinated plan. Now, again, remember, if we found the coordinated plans and we were to look into who wrote it and they made it public, right? This is not like you discovered Bill Cosby's secret plan. You actually found it plastered on the wall all around. Every McDonald's has the plan up, right? Of Bill Cosby's going to rob all the pudding pops. And yet no one gets in trouble. So let's move forward. Well, let's move backwards. Let's go back in time a little bit. You say, well, where does this come from? This is crazy. I've never heard anything like this. Well, you've heard probably me or many other people mention that famous big, fat, boring book, Tragedy and Hope. And let me tell you, it is boring. It is a nightmare to read that giant book. But our friend, Dr. Quigley, who was an apologist for this whole plan, well, he wrote a much smaller book that says everything and more called The Anglo-American Establishment. And again, I will warn you, this book is also very boring, but it's so revelatory. And he begins this book by saying that there was a plan devised out of the British Empire as the British Empire, the elect, the chosen of these elite British lords, Lord Milner, Lord Stead, Lord Brett, Cecil Rhodes, who ironically didn't he just get something torn down of his, which is ironic because the revolution, you see, eats itself, right? So here's the father of, in many ways, the modern world, in the sense of the round table groups and all that. He gets his statue torn down. But who's at the head of this? Well, we've got all these elite families. We've got Lord Rothschild here, according to Quigley, on page 39. We've got Rhodes, as I said, Milner. And then he said we've got a circle of initiates around them. It's called the Circle of Initiates. One of those was a famous cardinal, Cardinal Manning. Others were people like William Booth, or General Booth of the Salvation Army. And then a whole host of professors, academic idiots, right? Liberal professors who thought they were going to bring in this great commonwealth of God. This is what they called it, right? The commonwealth of God initially. And the way that they decided that they would have to do this was to infiltrate and control all the areas of society. Literally. Pages 64, 65. It's all about controlling every aspect of man's life. Full spectrum dominance, to use the term of William Engdahl, right? Great book, by the way. Now, they said we'd have to get rid of this older British imperial notion, right? Because that's got a lot of bad publicity surrounding it, you know, slavery, this kind of stuff. So let's rebrand this as a secular, technocratic order. And we will use the philosophy and propaganda of actually somebody who predates Bernays as a father of propaganda. He's probably the father of the modern world in many ways, Mr. H.G. Wells himself. And H.G. Wells said, we're going to have to just get rid of all of the old ways of doing things. Even this older British imperial notion will have to cave into a world federation of a secular technocratic order where every area of life is ruled by managerial technocrats. What's the last chapter of Bernays' book say? The last chapter says that the future is a managerial technocratic society. Let's move on to the next in our lecture here. More technocracy. Now, you probably heard about Mr. Salk. He's known for being the father of arm stabbies, right? And Mr. Salk wrote a famous book called The Survival of the Wisest. When we get back from the break, I'm going to tell you more about that. But you are watching The Alex Jones Show. I am Jay Dyer of jaysanalysis.com. When we come back, I'm going to tell you about Jonas Salk. I'm going to tell you about Jacques Attali. Do you know who that is? He's the Kissinger of France. You know, there's a Kissinger of France who trained and raised the modern presidents of France. I'll tell you about that in a minute. Welcome back to the Alex Jones Show. I'm your guest host, Jay Dyer of jaysanalysis.com. I was talking before the break about Jonas Salk, and there's a reason I'm going to go into Jonas Salk, because he wrote a couple books, one of which was extremely revealing, as I mentioned, called Survival of the Wisest. Now, why is this book so revelatory? Wasn't he a great hero of the arm stabbies and the butt stabbies? Not necessarily if we read his books, which most people don't do because these are actually out of print, very rare books. But I tracked them down, and I was blown away by what I read, because Mr. Salk is very candid about what he was really up to. You see, he says that since life is merely a random mutation, there's nothing wrong with randomly mutating the lives that exist, quite literally. The survival of the wisest is really the continuation of this radical social Darwinian, neo-Darwinian scheme that the technocratic priest class, the science class, right? Neil deGrasse Tyson, Bill Nye, these weirdos, these creeper deepers, they're going to be the ones who can decide who lives and who dies, who gets what in the future, who has a right to have kids, this kind of stuff. But it gets even crazier than that, because Salk tells us what his real religious views are. Yes, religious. You know, you would think he's a scientist, he's probably an atheist. No. He says that God is actually nature as a whole. And nature as a whole is in this constant flux process. And since it's in this constant meaningless flux process, it's up to the scientific priest class to commandeer evolution and do whatever's necessary for the survival of the species. Now, is he talking? Who's the species? Well, it's not every man, okay? Because to him, anybody below a certain IQ range is not a man. You don't have a soul. You're not really an entity. You're just kind of this random, pimple on Gaia's breasts, right? So you can be dispensed with. But instead, he says what we need to do is mutate man. We, like toxic Avenger level mad scientist stuff, we need to mutate man into becoming more than man, post-man, right? Post-human. And he says that we will do this through all kinds of secret experimentation, injunctions, diet, literally, pages 44 and 45. He says, because man is just a manimal. Isn't that a Muppet? Manimal? I don't know. But he says that this mystical evolutionary process can be controlled and can be commandeered by the scientific priest class. So there you have he literally says death is just as holy and pure as life. He says there are two complementary necessary forces. They're flip sides of the same coin, literally a Gnostic Luciferian perspective. And he says that since death needs life and since life needs death, there's absolutely nothing wrong with mad scientists just commandeering and injecting death for the purpose of mutating the species. But I mean, this guy is off the charts. Like, he doesn't stop there. He goes on to say that we can actually just engineer mass death. We can engineer experimentation on children even in the womb. Yes, he says that. And who does he say is the enemy? Who's the enemy of everybody in this great final revolution? Anybody with a traditional objective truth worldview. Anybody who believes that their position is correct. Anybody who's a Christian, anybody who has a religious worldview where you believe in objective truth. That's literally what he says. He says anybody who's dogmatic, quote unquote, must go. You're out. Get out of here. Down the garbage chute. But now wait a minute. Who's more dogmatic than Mr. Salk? Nobody. He's like the most dogmatic guy. So I mean, it's self-refuting at a fundamental level. But that's the reality here. And I think that when I show people that book, when I show people this stuff, most people have a really hard time processing it. They can't fathom that you would have this open plan, that it would be that open, even though H.G. Wells wrote a book called The Open Conspiracy, saying, here's what I'm going to do openly. Not just him, but him and everybody else in his cadre. But what I'm trying to show you is that from 100 years ago, it's the same plan. It's coordinated. It's the same plan from then, and older than that even, up until now. There's no divergence. They have like their own 10 commandments. You have to adhere to all the 10 commandments. And as I was mentioning last time, there's a couple more characters we're going to get to here. We're going to get to Arthur Koestler, and then we're going to mention Mr. Attali. Now, we've moved from older, British Empire period up to the 20s. We've looked at guys in the 50s and 60s. Salk. Let's look at another person in the 60s period. Mr. Arthur Koestler, Ghost in the Machine. He's another important figure that everybody overlooks. People forget this guy. But he was crucial to the philosophy of the global elite. In fact, many of the modern day global elite will cite this book. They'll cite him and his philosophy of how we're all part of this generic collective that's evolving. Right. The perennial philosophy. If you don't know, Huxley has a book called The Perennial Philosophy, where he says we're all part of this giant glob, and we're all just evolving to be the Godhead. Right? We're going to evolve to become the Godhead through technology. But before we get to that, let's look at this fascinating chapter on the Thuggee. Yes, remember Temple of Doom? Om Nam Shiva, Om Nam Shiva, Om Nam Shiva, Kalima Shakti. Right? Everybody remembers Temple of Doom. These guys love Temple of Doom in the real sense of the Thuggee. In fact, he has a whole section on the Thuggee, and he says, the Thuggee represent this older, this is page 236, this older idea of man evolving, and the fittest amongst men in the ancient world obviously just ate. There's absolutely nothing wrong with the human sacrifice cannibalism cults of the ancient world, the Aztecs, etc. It was purely natural. And by the way, it was noble. The nobility ate people. Are you going to say that all the nobility were bad because they were chomping down on their cousins and their brothers? No, I'm not going to say that. That would be bigoted. Can't be bigots. Don't be a bigot. Eat your cousin or you're a bigot. And so he says this sacrifice religion actually was what propelled man's evolution. It propelled man's evolution to the next phase. And he says that now years, has that shown you how crazy things are? Does this really sound that crazy now? And he says, look, at the end of the book, he says, we're in a crisis. We are in danger because the population is getting too big, right? Mother Gaia, we're all in the back of some giant turtle. This turtle is going to flip over unless we kill everybody except for our little precious cult. And by the way, if everybody in the cult is a bunch of human, they're just going to be eating each other. This is crazy. This is madness. But what it actually shows is that we are in a spiritual battle, right? And that's why he says death is just one of the natural processes that we must commandeer to get rid of the evolutionary freaks of nature, which are man himself, right? Man is an evolutionary freak of nature, he says on page 330. He says that death and disease are therefore good. More on that when we come back. Welcome back to the Alex Jones Show. I'm your guest host, Jay Dyer. If you want to get my books, you can go to my shop at the website, jaysanalysis.com. You'll see a shop there. You can also subscribe to my archive. You get access to years of lectures on the topics that you're hearing today. A lot of people don't have time to read these massive, boring tomes, and I don't blame you. And so that's what I do for you. I read these for you, and then I distill them into spastic, entertaining presentations. I was mentioning Mr. Koestler, and finishing up with him, Koestler says, look, it's time to utilize mass mind control on the population. That's literally what he says on pages 332 and 33. He says that mass mind control as a result of the CIA-sponsored conferences in the 60s at the University of California, of San Francisco Medical Center. Holger Heiden, by the way, who I covered in my book, at this conference, they talked about how they could use mass media for mind control. They talked about how they could manipulate RNA and DNA. Yes, back in the 60s, right? Kessler wrote about this. He says that we can increase suggestibility through the mass media, and at the same time, we can go in and manipulate people's RNA and DNA. He says we'll use binary weapons. That's what he says on 334. And that this will all be combined with the poison in the tap water. Yes, poison in the tap water. So all this stuff that you've heard people talking about, John P. Holdren, the science czar under Obama, Paul Ehrlich, right? It's all going back to 50s, 60s, all the way back to Bertrand Russell. But I'm just showing you the continuity through the decades of this unified plan. He says that Big Pharma will have to take a lead role in this first phase, he says, back in the 60s, of beginning to promote large-scale pharmaceuticals in that Brave New World mindset. And he says, eventually, we're just going to have to give everybody a pill. Everybody will have their soma. And he says the whole of the tap water will be poisoned. Literally, that's the end of the book. And he says, this will all be alchemy. Literally, he says alchemy for the process of transhumanism. So they want this mass die-off, this mass kill-off before transitioning into the next phase of the post-human era. Now, I mentioned earlier,
Mr. President Henry Kissinger, I would like one baguette. Give me one baguette made of dead babies from France.
Who is the Kissinger of France? Jacques Attali, right? He's the brains behind some of the recent presidents of France. And he wrote a really interesting book. Let's fast forward up to 2006. Mr. Attali wrote a book called Brief History of the Future. This is an overlooked global elite book. People forget this guy. They forget that he wrote everything in his book. And the first 4 or 5 chapters are really boring. I'm going to breeze past those, but basically he just says, look, all of history is evolving to be a collective, right? In the ancient times, you had these empires. Man came out of muck, soup, whatever. Now we've got these empires, and they've given way to the final empire of global democracy. We hear this term all that we're a republic, we're not a democracy. But regardless, as the news clip at the beginning said, this democracy now has to give way to more freedom? No, to a planetary empire. What? A planetary empire? Yes, he says by 2040, he says we're going to have little assistant robots that will be rolling around your house, little bitch bots, bitching you around, doing who knows what, being your companion perhaps, going around grabbing butts, little gross perv robots running everything in your household. Literally, he says every household will have one of these little bitch bots running around, bossing you around, telling you what to do, telling you to clean your room, right? Because he won't do it, right? But he's going to teach your kids, and that's what he says. Is these little robots, little bitch bots rolling around, they're going to be preaching and teaching you everything that you'll know about the external world, right? This is beyond Skynet. This is not just, this is like, it's every dystopian story. They picked up the worst elements and said, let's make the mega dystopia, right? Imagine something worse than a Roomba, right? Like a little dictator Roomba, right? And he says these bots are going to control your perception of the external world. All of your education will come through your little house bot, your little coffin apartment bot. And he says America has to go away, right? We got to get rid of this stuff. This is the old thing. America's going away. That's old school. America, he says, and all nation states have to be dismantled. Every nation state, every firewall has to be completely dismantled so that the giant global system can come into place, and he calls it a global brain. In fact, he calls it a golem, right? If you remember the mystical story of the golem, this is this creature that can be created and it doesn't have a soul. It's given reality and it's controlled. And he says that the whole world will be like this giant golem brain that everybody's jacked into, right? And that you will get your daily download. And he says slavery will return, right? Yes, slavery will return, but it will be a slavery to the bots and to the giant AI global brain. And he says all of the things that you've seen rolling out in the last decade. Now, remember, he wrote this in 2006, and he says that in the next few years, what you're going to see is the rollout of the importance of the cell phone. And he says that's just one phase, though, right? He says, but because what the cell phone would do would cause everybody to become rootless cosmopolitans. He says the cell phone would make everybody into nomadic losers, where you would no longer be grounded and rooted in anything in terms of your heritage, in terms of your history, in terms of your background, your religious philosophy. He says all that's going to be destroyed by the cell phone. He says, but that's just one phase, you see. That's going to go away. And what will give rise to this global culture will be a global pop culture. Spurts, sports ball, right? All of that will be made global. There'll probably be Hunger Games type stuff on a global scale. He says, he intimates that there will be things like that, like Hunger Games style, death race type stuff going on. And that what that will do is get everybody into a global mindset through the pop culture, through the sports, through the globalized, whatever the new version of Hollywood's going to be, the streaming services or whatever. And he says, we'll even take the churches, this is key, these big World Council of Churches, New Agey churches. He says, we're going to co-opt all of those into being engines and arms of this global order. Remember, it's a full spectrum dominance plan. So that means every area of life has to be converted over into this big plan. He says, especially the Catholic Church. He says, this one is key because it's so big. He says, we have to turn that into an engine of the global technocratic order. And that would go for the other religions as well, right? I'm not saying that the other religions are exempted. No, it's the subversion of all of the major religions to turn them into engines of this religion. And then the greatest of the quotes in this book, now I'm not saying greatest in a good sense, I'm saying greatest in terms of importance, is he says there's a vanguard to this group, and he calls it hyper-democracy. Right. He's talking about the social justice, hyper-democracy, radical equalitarianism, right, all this stuff. He says the vanguard of this group are called the transhumanists. So he says on page 260, he says that the transhumanists are a vanguard of the new world order, and they're going to create a universal brotherhood, right? A universal brotherhood. He says among these transhumanists, we could cite Bill and Melinda Gates, Mother Teresa, and many, many, many New Age weirdos, right? So he lists all these different weirdos, and he says by 2100, we'll have all of the world converted over to this thing, right? 2030, 2050, 2100. These are the key actuaried years, right? And by 2100, he says there'll be all mega cities. You'll all have to be, piled into these cities. Have you seen that movie Code 46 with Tim Robbins? You seen this? Right. This movie actually exemplifies what I'm talking about right here. Right. Children of Men, same idea. These films show that the giant mega cities where everybody's forced to live. You can't live on the land anymore. You can't be on the country. You can't be a country bumpkin anymore. Country boys cannot survive in this global order. You got to be moved into the mega cities. He says that will all be in place along with the giant global brain by 2100. That's what's coming. This is future history being written right here. Here's the plan. I'm Jay Dyer. Yes, I do it really good. David Rockefeller. Come on, admit it, right? Let's talk about David Rockefeller, because as I was ending that last segment, I was talking about the religion that has to be brought about. We got to have a fake religion, a bunch of fake churches, and a cult for the new world. Well, in the authorized biography of the Rockefellers, there's in fact an entire chapter on the new fake religion. And back in the 30s, yes, 1932, the 30s, Daddy Rockefeller, Jr., he says we got to have a world religion. And this world religion will be able to bring about our global plan better than anything else, right? Because everybody needs a religion. Everybody needs something to believe in. It's one of the easiest tools from the elite perspective, right? Or how to manipulate the population. So $75 million back in the 30s, that's, basically $1 zillion today, according to accurate mathematical formulations. Imagine how much money. So what was the purpose of this? To create the global fake ecumenist movement, right? And so the Rockefellers not only did that, they also set up the Riverside Church, which had these statues to people like Darwin and Moses, and just a bizarre mix. But the whole chapter ends here, page 155, by saying that together with the money donated to countless seminaries across the country, $75 million would be given everywhere, just spread out, making it rain everywhere, right? To create a National Council of Churches. And this National Council of Churches would be an engine to promote liberation theology, right? Yes, liberation theology. It's a Rockefeller. Did you know that the Rockefellers are big fans of liberation theology? Now, why would they be fans of communist ideas? I just can't figure out why anybody with a lot of money would like communism. That doesn't make any sense, because the communists are against the people with money, right? No, they're not. Always, all the way back to Quigley. Go back to Quigley, right? When he's talking about the French Revolution, those commies in the French Revolution. Guess where they got their money? From banking elite, from wealthy Protestant and Swiss and other families. There's a whole chapter Quigley has on that. The French Revolution getting all this money to destroy the country. Do you think it's any different now? Well, no, it's not any different, right? Who are the protesters in the street, right? They're fighting the system, and the entire system's giving them hundreds of millions of dollars. I mean, it's ludicrous. But once you understand that the richest people on the planet love communism, I mean, they love it. It's their favorite thing, right? They lick their lips at communism. They want to lick Marx's beard. They want to eat the food out of Karl Marx's beard. That's how much they love communism, right? And they openly say it, right? In the 1978 or 9 editorial from a China Traveler by David Rockefeller. There's also a lesser known essay, by the way, in Yale. There's the old Yale publication about Mao. Mao was a Yali. Did you know that? Yale and China. And this essay talks about, it's Yale's publication, that the Skull and Bones Society wanted to put Mao into power to have this revolution in China, to completely, basically rewrite the country. That's why, as I'm sure you've heard Alex mention many times, Chiang Kai-shek, they discarded him, get him out of here, and let's put our full weight and support behind Mao. In fact, I've got Bill Donovan, right, founder of the OSS. I've got his autobiography. He brags about it. He says, we wanted to put Mao in, right? This is a great thing, right, to destroy this whole country. It was so great. Then fast forward, you've got in the middle of David Rockefeller's memoirs, he says, the whole Nixon thing, remember Nixon going to China, right? He says, no, that was actually me. He says, I wanted to put Chase Bank in communist China so that it would be the bank. And he brags about that. That's why he writes the China Traveler editorial, bragging and saying that was all engineered so that David Rockefeller could get his thing going in China. Now, I mentioned the religion earlier in terms of older plans with H.G. Wells and these characters. I didn't even know about this book, and this is what I do all the time, read all these nerdy, boring books. And what do you know? H.G. Wells has a book about the coming religion. It's called God, the Invisible King. And you see that title and you think, well, that sounds good. I mean, H.G. Wells, he believes in God, right? H.G. Wells was a hardcore communist who said, the family, it's gone. We got to end the family. That's the enemy number one, right? Traditional religion, enemy number two. Nation states, enemy number three, right? I mean, just total lunatic. And all of his science fiction, by the way, he transmits the same idea throughout all of his science fiction. But he wrote this obscure book that I came across, and he outlines what the coming religion is. And it might surprise you because you think, well, he's going to say it's like a atheistic thing and it's all fake. Actually, he says that we do have a personal deity that we believe in. Now, he does say it's like personified generic nature and evolutionary process. Yeah. But on page 101, he says that we're not talking about Jesus. We don't want none of that Jesus. Get that out of here. That's not what we're talking about. He says our God is Prometheus. What? Yes. It's like that angel of light, Lucifer. He says that's our real God. Literally, Lucifer. Now, You can debate whether he thought that was a real entity or whether it was just some sort of symbolic thing, but he kind of goes back and forth in the book. He doesn't seem to say for sure whether he thinks it's, but it's basically it's an antichrist type of thing is what I'm trying to get at here, right? I mean, it doesn't matter whether he thinks it's a real entity or not. He's basically saying, I serve this antichrist spirit that I'm going to call Lucifer that's going to erect the scientific Star Trek utopia. Literally, he says the Star Trek utopia. He says in the other book, either Open Conspiracy or New World Order, he says, you've all got to die for our Star Trek future. We're going to have a federation of planets and all this kind of stuff. And you all got to die. But look, at least you're going to die for something good. At least I'm going to give you something to die for. Don't you appreciate that? So I can go be Captain Kirk, right? Flying around, having sex with the green space women, right? That's what he says. He doesn't say the space women, but you know what I mean. And so, look, what I'm trying to get across is that whether we go back 100 years or whether we go back to, or whether we fast forward to the present day, what I mentioned last time with Alex, right? The head of Davos, Klaus Schwab, he writes a whole book saying exactly the same thing that the people 100 years ago said. Here it is, right? The shape of things to come. You ever watched that movie? It's hard to watch because it's really grainy, bad, but H.G. Wells, he made that. Well, the story was written before World War II. And what does it predict? It predicts a big world war with flying Masonic ships bombing everything. Literally, that's what he says. And so you fast forward to Klaus Schwab, and we have the Internet of Things. We have biotech. We have geoengineering, all listed, all public. And I'm going to give you one last obscure book that a lot of people don't know about and they have forgotten. And it's part of this inner cadre, this inner cult. And his name was Charles Galton Darwin. He wrote a book called The Next Million Years. I don't know how he knew what was going to happen in a million years. That's a pretty big number, a million years, right? It's like when they talk about how Attali has this chapter about 11 million years ago, a monkey jumped out of a tree, and that's how humans started walking, was because it was 11. How do you know what happened 11 million years ago? Give me a break. Come on. But regardless, even though it sounds like science fiction, in their mind, they're writing future history by putting out the science fiction, right? So what does he say? Now, you might think again, well, he's going to be talking about, science and the importance of science. Yeah, he does say that. But who does he say the future will belong to? He says DNA, RNA, tracking, tracing, all of that, literally. He says, will tell us who the superior bloodlines are. What? Yes, bloodlines. He says the elite have known about and worshipped bloodlines all the way back to Ptolemy and ancient dynasties. He says these royal bloodlines will be tweaked so that you'll have breeders and specified breeding so that only the elite bloodlines can go into the future. What do we see in the news now? COVID pass, right? Bill Gates, we got to get these numbers down. Here's my chart for the numbers. And if we get all these numbers down, then maybe I can corner the market on New Balance sneakers with my slave class market that's building all my New Balance sneakers, right? Bill Gates, COVID pass, 50 years ago, Charles Galton Darwin. I'm Jay Dyer of Jay's Analysis. Thank you for letting me be here. This is the Alex Jones Show. Be sure and support InfoWars. Support them in any way. Get this out. Share this stuff. Buy my